Mandelbrot to a breakthrough. In 1980, he created an equation of his own, one that combined all of the Julius sets into a single image. When Mandelbrot iterated his equation, he got his own set of numbers. Graphed on a computer, it was a kind of roadmap of all the Julius sets, and quickly became famous as the emblem of fractal geometry. The Mandelbrot set.
It's not easy to describe the Mandelbrot set visually. It looks like a man, it looks like a cat, it looks like a cactus, it looks like a cockroach. It's got little bits and pieces that remind us of almost anything that you can see out in the real world, particularly living things. So it has a character that reminds us of a lot of things, and yet it itself is unique and new.
The Mandelbrot set is real, an absolute thing, no question whatsoever. Any mathematician or any computer scientist or student in a school can study it and find the same, describe the same thing. It's a common experience. And so such things that can be magnified forever and have infinite precision do exist, but they're not touchable.
It's a geometrical shape, an icon, if you wish, which somehow embodies as an example a very important aspect of how the world works. Somebody recently actually called this set the thumbprint of God.
With this mysterious image, Mandelbrot was issuing a bold challenge to long-standing ideas about the limits of mathematics.
The blinders came off, and people could see forms that were always there, but formerly were invisible.
The Mandelbrot set was a great example of what you could do in fractal geometry, just as the archetypical example of classical geometry is the circle.
When you zoom in, you see them coming up again, so you see self-similarity. You see, by zooming in, you zoom, you're zooming in, you're zooming in, and pop. Suddenly it seems like you're exactly where you were before, but you're not. It's just that way down there, it has the same kind of structure as way up here, and the sameness can be grokked.
Now we'll begin our serious exploration of the Mandelbrot set, a voyage which in fact could last forever and ever, much longer than the lifetime of the universe. I have here the full set, about 6 inches across. Now, if I blow this up, I'll increase the magnification now 13 times, and you'll see more and more detail is appearing. And the interesting thing is you see mini Mandelbrots, replicas, almost identical, yet perhaps subtly different, of the original set. And I can go on doing this. Here's a magnification of more than 3,000 times. So the original picture, about 6 inches across, is now half a mile across. And no matter how much we magnified it, a million times, a billion times, until the original set was bigger than the entire universe, we would still see new patterns, new images emerging, because the frontier, the M set, is infinitely complex. And when I say infinitely, I really mean that. Most people, when they say infinitely, they mean only rather big. But this is really infinity. What is so remarkable, in fact, astounding, about the Mandelbrot set is that although it's infinitely complex, it's based on incredibly simple principles, unlike almost everything in modern mathematics. In fact, anybody who can add and multiply can understand the principles on which it's based. You don't even have to subtract or divide, still less use logarithms or trigonometrical functions to comprehend how the Mandelbrot set is created. In fact, in principle, it could have been discovered any time in human history and not merely in 1980. But the problem is this: although it's only based on adding and multiplying, you have to carry out those operations millions, billions of times to create a complete set. And that's why it was not discovered until the era of modern computers.
Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into unrighteous path, and guard us from evil. Amen. All right, let's go. So it's gonna be something kind of different, a little interesting dive today. History, some science, some biblical texts, some mysteries, right? You know how it is. So we're going to dive into some interesting things today. So with that, we're going to get right to it. All right. So I was having a conversation the other day, if you remember, with an individual by the name of Jungle Jargon. This is Jungle Jargon. And I found out something really interesting and important that I think I want to go over at a separate time. So I'm going to set today as that day to go over this today. So it has to do with a piece of history that a lot of people actually don't know about. It has to do with something that is very important. So if you know in the Bible, right, there's always a confrontation that happens about the time when the Israelites get into the land of Canaan, right? And one of the biggest groups for their constant going at it is, if you know the story, right, David and Goliath, classic story. Got a major character there by the name of basically Goliath, right? And obviously David going against him. But he is a Philistine. But here's the interesting thing that you got to know about history, right? Now, the Bible is good to have, but the Bible is meant to be studied on a historical basis, right? That's very important. What do I mean by a historical basis, right? We can't take the Bible and use our current status of ethics or ethnicity or people today and say that's what it always been. For example, right? Let's just look in a quick little tree real fast. If you look up sons of Noah, right? And we'll ask ourselves who was in the areas of the Levant, who was in Mesopotamia, who was the ones that's there. But we gotta look at a tree real fast. If we look at where it says the Philistines, we get an interesting understanding real fast when we think about who are the Philistines. Now, the first thing that most people already know is that the Philistines would be obviously Hamites under the line of Ham. We can see it actually Philistum. That's actually going to be the Philistines. But here's where it gets kind of interesting. If you also had studied history of the Hittites, you know that the Hittites had went through a type of change, right? Because the Hittites were originally from Heth, the son of Ham. But the Hittites made a change. Here's a quick summary of that real fast. You look up a little Hittites, and we're going to do a little deeper study, but first, just to get a quick flash of a summary of history of the Hittites. What happens with the Hittites is a very interesting invasion. A lot of people already know about it, but here is a quick summary. I'll just show you right here. So here's a little history of them. Just talks a little bit of the Hittite language and everything and what was going on there. Just going to go down a little bit. But it just talks about, according to some individuals, this is what happened. The Indo European element at least establishes the Hittite culture, right? Now, already just off that fact, Indo European Hittites, right? Now you also have to take who would be Indo European based on the biblical narrative, right? Now, there's a lot of assumptions that automatically come into play, right? If you think Indo European, you're usually thinking Caucasian, or you're thinking in the sense of someone who's pale. But what I'm going to show you today is also something to understand, that Indo European is a linguistics, right? It's a language first. So understanding that first is going to be important. But before we get modern or the Indo European that comes about 500 BC or 5,000 BC or 4,000 BC rather, there's a Proto-Indo-European, right? Proto-Indo-European peoples who actually was spread from one area to another. But it'll let you know that that area where we get that linguistic is mostly in areas of Europe. For example, even here where it talks about from 4,200 to 4,000 BC, just talk about pretty much one of the languages that was found in the areas of Europe. Just to get a quick summary of that. But it'll go on, it'll let you know, I'm just going to give a quick summary right here. It'll let you know the appearance of Indo-European speakers from Europe into Anatolia. Now, here's where it's going to get kind of interesting. It's telling us about a time that Anatolia, right, started to get filled up with a lot of Indo-European speakers, right? And the appearance of Hittite, right, is related to later migrations of Proto-Indo-European speakers from the Umayyad culture, right? Now, this is where it's going to get kind of interesting to look at these things, right? Because a lot of these cultures, we already have their genetics. We have a lot of these things for all these things. But now you got a good understanding that we know that the actually was a Indo-European group. Where's the Umayyad culture? You can see Umayyad. or Yamnaya culture. And the Yamnaya culture actually is apparently mixed in with these groups. So we're going to have, and note the year there, 4000 BC. So that's a long time ago. We're talking 6,000 years ago. Now, understand when I say the biblical narrative, we do believe the biblical narrative, but just take me when I say this, that we're going to have to use these scientific scales just to get a good understanding of what's going on here. Then we can compress it into the biblical narrative. Because remember, the biblical narrative is telling the beginning to the ending. And I expressed that when we had talked about the flood, we talked about how the earth was made, all those things and whatnot. But don't worry about these years. Just understand anything that's further back is closer to Adam, right? We'll talk about these things as we go along. Very important. That's just giving us some understanding of some area or some movements that was happening with the Hittites. Now let's dive a little deeper into it, because Wikipedia is nice and all, but it's just a scratch of the surface. It's a source that leads to sources, right? All right, so let's get a little understanding of these things, because we actually have to first understand something very interesting. Let me actually open something here and show something here. So there was a fairly recent interesting study, and it talked about basically some of the fossils that they found during the Bronze Age and the Levant. And what they found was that some of the individuals had a very interesting mixture, right? Leading us to where they must have came from. Now, historical documents also contest of migrations from certain areas, but it's also nice to have the genetics to kind of look at the picture in a totality, so that we can get the full picture of what's going on, so that we're not just taking someone from the areas of Levant and saying they're all the same people. Let's see what this study says right here. It has a very interesting statement that it makes. It says, it's going to move that. It says the Bronze Age, it says 3,500 to 1,150 BC, was a formative period in the southern Levant, a region that includes present-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestinian authorities, right? And southwest Syria. Just talks about a little bit of that era. I'm just going to skip a little down just to kind of skip. It just talks about some of the biblical, obviously, individuals that would exist in the Iron Age. I'm just going to go down a little bit. It just talks about some of the different individuals that would exist. Obviously, Israel, right? The biblical Israel, Judah, Ammon, Moab, right? Some of the ones in Syria. I'm just going to skip a little down right to the meat of it. All right, so watch what it says right here. Archaeological and historical research has documented major changes during the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Now, we're also going to have some in the Neolithic. That's what we were just looking at just earlier. That is going to be some things that happened very early, such as the culture influence of the northern, right, Caucasian populations related to the Cor-Araxes traditions during the early Bronze Age. Now, what does he mean, the Cor-Araxes traditions and things like that? It's basically, it's going to connect the culture, basically a highly Indo European culture that we know is Indo European, but it also continues and says tradition during the early Bronze Age and effects from the sea people, such as the Philistines. So that's important, because for understanding the biblical narrative, we got to know a little bit of history, right? We got to know a little history of the changes of the Levant, how the Levant was affected throughout history. Let me just point out something with the Cor-Araxes population. As always, these are very early societies, right? Let's talk about something from, said, 4000 BC until about 2000 BC. So when you hear that Cor-Araxes culture, that's going to be some very early culture. We can talk about that real fast. Let's just point out some of the genetics that's on there. On here, I'm sure this has one. Otherwise, I got a list of it. I'm sure it's probably somewhere. Let me see if it's on here. No, I got a list of it, of the Cor-Araxes culture. It's a very mixed company, but what we're gonna do is show the totality of who are the children of Japheth, right? The whole lines of it. So we're gonna kind of look at that today. Now, let me just kind of show something a little different real fast. I'm just leave this here. Let me just show something. I'm always keeping track when people are touching on genetics and things like that, because I think it does. If you find the truth, it's not going to change, right? The truth is going to stay the same. And I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see the whole picture when everything's at its full totality. But let me show you something I thought was interesting that on Answers of Genesis, you get Dr. Nathan Jensen still trying to sell the book that he has, which I'm going to talk about a little bit because I got the book downloaded. We're going to talk a little bit of something on that book. Yeah. Let me just show something here. Now, he came to a very interesting conclusion, which I've been saying for a long time. That's very important. And it has to do with what is called monophyletic families, or one clade or one node, right? And it has to do with this H that he just pointed out, and pointing out the fact that this I and J is actually Indo European. So that's extremely important that we can find an ancient Indo European branch, right? So it talks about Indo Europeans are I and J, and he actually changed. Let me actually open up something on Trace. This is actually kind of interesting because I kind of said this. I said that, you know, as these things go on, I gotta think about where it is on the downloads right here. As these things go on and evolve, kind of do different things, you're gonna start seeing different conclusions from geneticists, because if they don't have the truth, they're gonna find the truth. That's what's gonna happen. If they don't already have the truth, they're gonna have to keep changing it until they come to the perfect understanding of the truth, right? Let me just show something with the H that he has on here. And we're going to also look at the F. Why are these important? Because these are actually some of the earliest lineages of Indo-European. And this is what I was talking about. That H is F is the original Indo-European, the ancient Indo-European lines, which many lines come from. Let me just point it out on here so we can look at that. This thing just loads slow. I don't know why. All right. I'm going to just put India here so we can just jump right to the place on here while it's loading. His little thing kind of loads slow, or it got a lot of stuff in it. I'll just try to find it real fast so I can point it out. Let's just see where it is. So, right, if you've never seen some of his work, you know, I do recommend checking it out. But it's with a eye of discernment to discern these things. Okay, so here it is. All right, so here he talks about what he tried to do is, I've been talking about this a lot, that the Dravidian language, the Elamite language, which these are connection with how you say, let me open up a tab here. These are connections to ancient Shemite languages, just a little different branch than the Akkadian branches, right? The Akkadian, the Ebla type Shemitic is going to be a type of language that would be more, I would say, just open up something here while I'm thinking. It would be a language that's tied to the Yap groups. That's what it would be tied to, rather to the Yap groups than to the H group, which a lot of people, modern H, right? Modern H, you will see a lot of them having the Davidian language, but that's modern people, right? Modern H has a Davidian language, not ancient H. But where did H go? Where did H move into? Because this is why we got to look into ancient fossils, because we actually know that H moved with an E, and that E group is actually important to note that it also moved with a T. For example, we can see right here. I'm just gonna copy a little bit something here, right here, and just point it out, just to read it. All right. My bad there. Meant to do this. All right, so watch what it says here. Just talks about a little results that they had in 2016, right here from this paper. Just talk about basically make insight into the origins of farming in the ancient Near East. So interesting results in it. And this is what he actually found out from some of those results. Just talks about, obviously, they tested the Natufian. Obviously, those had those early E's. And just let you know they got CT there and they got E1B1 because CT makes your E groups and your CT makes your DE groups and your CF groups. But notice what it'll talk about. Obviously, these are the oldest E groups. Remember, E1B1B is not actually African. It's actually going to be areas from Arabian, and Mesopotamian, and Levantan. But it says right here, because obviously the Natufian finds. But watch what it says right here. These are to date the oldest known E1B1B individuals. The same haplogroups show up in pre-pottery Neolithic B Jordan, accompanied by new haplogroups, H2 and T. So that's very important. And in fact, if we go to haplogroup H, and we just take a look at H's origin, not the mtDNA, but the Y DNA. Go to that real fast. We'll just go to H2. Right? Let's see if this is it. Let's go to it over here. All right, so watch what it says about the H group real fast. So obviously we know it's mainly in here at this time, but we do know that it did move into that group that was once at first the Natufians, as we can see right there. However, the primary branch H2 seems to have been found in sparse levels, primary in Europe, right? So this line is mainly in Europe, West Asia, since prehistory or pre-pottery Neolithic B, right, is part of obviously the pre-pottery Neolithic, a Neolithic culture captured in Upper Mesopotamia, right? So that's very important. And the Levant, and they'll say during this long time ago, right? Just talk about some other place it was at, obviously spread across different areas through Europe. Let's go down a little bit. And we can see, obviously, some of the finds. Look what they found there. In 11 to 900 BC, they've obviously found H. But notice what it was accompanied by. E1B1B. So when we have this H group, we're actually noticing that this Davidian lineage is also accompanied by the original Davidian lineage, which is actually the E lineage. Now, when I say original, we have to go into the concept of how this group went into the BMAC culture and became a ruling power there. But notice where did H actually come from? We know it came from the split of HIJK. Now, if you already know, R comes from HIJK. J comes from HIJK because they're all family. When I say they come from them, we got to talk about how they branch, right? From HIJK comes IJK, comes IJ, comes your IJ groups, right? Which is your J and your I. And then from HIJK come your IJK, comes your basically your K-M9, comes your K2, which makes your MNOP, right? And P actually makes R and Q. So that's to know. But going down, so we can see some other finds, some other places. What's also interesting is to notice, remember the first ones it was with what? E1B1B and your T, just like we seen earlier when we was looking at some of the other finds. Remember we seen that E1B1B, right? It accompanied with new haplogroups, H2 and T. So the new haplogroups was H2 and T. And if we notice, on the H group, it'll tell you right away that it was accompanied by E and T. So that's very important. So, and then obviously the time goes down all the way into the time of our time. So we get some other groups that start to mix in, right? Some I's, some G's, some J's, right? Interesting lineages, those I, G's, and J's. When you actually note that GHIJK makes almost all of these besides your E group, which comes from your DE. That's very important. But they both split. DE and CF actually splits at CT, which is very important to them. So we can get a good understanding of some of these things, a couple ideas on them. Close that. That's just to get a nice, quick family tie for these branches, because we're going to have to get a good understanding of the monophylactic family to understand what is or who is Japheth. So it'll let you know that this group
J either conquered H or H was assimilated into I and J.
So now what is actually we're seeing here is that HIJK is one family. That's rather what we're seeing here. If we look at the monophylactic families, we got to note the roots, and the roots actually show us that HIJK is one family. We also have the fossils for those HIJK that we know they are existing fossils that also is one family. So you can see he actually concluded that H was Indo-Europeans, but in his book that he sold, he said that they were Dravidians. But I was saying that they can't be Dravidians because GHIJK is one family. And the thing about also Dravidians and other groups and all that is that a lot of those, originally, a lot of those groups had some Shemites with them. They had a lot of Shemites mixed in these groups. And that's why we're concluding with that E group. But focusing on the H, we can obviously get a good portion that obviously modern times is here, right? That's very important to know that in modern times will be there, but in ancient times, not so. That's very important for understanding some things like the Dravidian language and things like that. Let me go back up real fast because Dravidian actually is an ancient language, the ancient linguistics that H wasn't part of in his original time. It was actually Indo-European. H was actually an Indo-European line. T as well. T was actually Indo-European that also assimilated into these groups. That's very important as well. But you can see here's what he was just showing on here. He was just talking about basically how he changed his mind. Why is that important? Because that's what we're going to talk about real fast. That he had changed his mind, how he had H as Dravidian, as origin, and then he made basically it Indo-European. But then he had a look into another group that he said he was restoring, quote unquote, this is what he says. He said that he was restoring their culture, restoring their tradition, and it's the F group. Now, here's what's interesting, because if you look at what Jensen actually writes about F, there's nothing there. There's not, when he sold the book on F, there was not enough information when this book came out. And the reason why I say that is because you don't want to give a complete, like, for example, it'd be better if you made the book in parts instead of giving a complete picture but an incomplete book, because now we have a book that says H is Dravidian but it's not Dravidian. And also for F, let me just go to that. Let me just go up to F, because one of the main F groups that we have to know is not just F1 or F2 or F3, but F-M89. That's going to be a very important group to know about. F-M89. Let me just go to where the F, he talks about F on here. Doesn't really have like great separation spots. In fact, I think maybe see if he got a one of those little things in front. Let me see. Here it is, the index. I just want to go right to, yeah, he doesn't really, I already seen the index. His index is not the best for finding stuff. That's as much as you get with the index. But let me just go to that with F. I know where that's at on here. It's no problem to find. But let me just show that so that we can get a look at it. Because it's actually CF. It's C and F. That's a combination that actually makes one whole family, right? And that's going to be very important to know, because that one family is going to be Japheth. A large part of it is Indo-European, but there's one certain branch that makes almost all of them, which is your F-M89, which is your one of the major Indo-European groups. Let me see if I can find that on here. Okay. It's just interesting how he puts the split, which makes to me no sense genetically. The reason why is because I'll just show you real fast. Just talk about this split real fast. Why is this a problem? Because F makes these lineages. F-M89, you can look at it on any unrooted design, right? That's your genome project.
have star graphs of the design of how F is made and K is made, and they actually circle around all these lineages. All these lineages under F will be related. But this is what's interesting about it, is that from this split right here, this will be a node, and we will have F and C, and then it will go over here, and you'll have some other branches. So there's a split apparently right here for your separation of an A and B, and a separation of D and E groups. Now, what's interesting here is how are they making each other, right? How is F making your? Because look, you can see the node goes down, so this means that whatever this is making this. So that's what's interesting, is that he doesn't actually even explain what's actually making these, or how these are even being made. But we know that A and B on the evolutionary chart, A and B said makes all these, but we know that's not true, right? If you already had to subscribe on one of the main videos I put there is the video of how these monophylactic families work. And we know that A and B is two separate lineages. They don't make anything under CT, which things that come from CT are CF and DE, which CF actually includes all of these on this side. So that's actually kind of important, just to get a little understanding on that. But you can see right here, just to get a little understanding, if you had seen this one where he goes over F, right? He doesn't go over the full understanding of it, but he leans towards it to kind of give a sense that it is important to look at, that it might have some evidence of early lineages here. Now, the thing about F, you got to look at the whole picture of F. You got to look at the fossils. You got to look at F-M89. You got to get the full picture of what's going on there. And F will tell you itself that it actually originated in Europe and is spread throughout the areas all the way to China, right? So it will have a large dominance in the areas of Europe. So that's very important to know. But let me see if I can point out in here real fast where he talks about F, as I think it's kind of interesting. Let's see if we can find it really fast. Shouldn't be too far here. This one just goes over a couple things of A. We got R. We got R1A. Just gonna go down because he also has just a simple list, which I'm just gonna go to real fast, that points out what all he believes they are. And just go down to it and point it out real fast. All right. Let that load up. Okay. So that's why, having this conversation, I believe is important, because F, I think, is a quite important lineage to know. So you can see right here, this is just something we're going to note in a second. Let me just go down to it to see if I can find where he has that little highlight here. Almost. I know it's under here. All right, so here it is. All right, so now he puts biblical lineage as Ham. He puts G as Ham. He puts H as Ham. But also remember, in this little video that he just did, he knows that H is actually Indo European. He knows that H is actually an Indo European lineage. That's going to be very important. And also tell by its monophylactic families. But you can see right here, separate ways, with I ending up in Europe, J ending up in Asia, most of H ending up in India, and a very rare subset of H ending up in Europe. The reason I've told you all this, that I've rethought H, is because if H is indeed Indo-European, that it was in the Ural Mountain north of the Black Sea area in ancient times, and not in India, that means H is probably not the explanation for the origin of the peoples of the Indus Valley civilization. It makes this question open again. So who gave rise to the Indus Valley people? Just to summarize, what I say in the book, I think, is
Probably not the explanation. In the book I say haplogroup H's. Now I'm thinking haplogroup H is probably part of the Indo Europeans, which raises the question, well then who is? Who gave rise to these early people? One of the best candidates moving forward is what I'm calling haplogroup F. You may say, what in the world are you calling haplogroup F? Is Indus Valley Civilization, if you look at the haplogroup F map in the book, India, South Asia is blank. I've got no circles there for F.
All right, so you see why I'm showing you this. So like he said, his information for F in the book, let's look at it. Early geographic location unknown, history unknown. Now, why does he put unknown? I don't think he looked into F enough. I don't really even think he looked into F, to be honest with you. I think that he just put it on the chart because even the way that he makes it monophylactically doesn't make sense. But understand, I'm also a believer in all these things. I just also look into these things carefully because it's important that we have truth. There's no one I know that can use this book trace to defend the order of how these individuals came into existence. There's no one that can use the book trace as a source to provide that this is true, that these things are true, because trace doesn't support science and trace doesn't even have historical documents to back it up enough. So again, I'm not trying to knock them, but I'm trying to tell you the truth. So right here at F, just to get a good understanding of F, let's look a little more into F real fast. Let's look at the big picture of F to get a good of it. Let me actually real fast. I'm gonna go to something on here. In fact, I'll leave this here and just open up another because we're gonna look at F real fast for a good second. Because F actually is a picture on who is Japheth, right? F is actually going to paint the picture of who is Japheth, right? Not just F1, not just F2 or F3, but F-M89 specifically. F-M89, right? That's very important. So I'm just going to pop it up real fast and dive a little bit into its fossilized origins and kind of get into how do we know that these lineages come from F, right? And why is F so important? Why is F so important? Because it links your H's, it links your I's, it links your J's, it links everything under K-M89, which is your T's and L's and MNOPs and Q's, R's, things like that. So here's the origins of. So just to get a full of F, here's a good understanding of F. Here's a nice little video. I think this person did a job. At least he did okay. So obviously, we have evidence of areas of pretty much area up here. So we're gonna have evidence of F going up here, but at first it's gonna start over here and it's gonna spread over here. Well, look at that. It's fossils. There is evidence of F being over in these areas very early, right? It's going to skip a little bit and just do these little branches out. I'm just going to open it up. So he just talks about some places over here that it obviously developed at in these little areas. Just going to skip a little over. Whatnot. Just giving us a good understanding. But he lets us know something very important too. Real fast. Right here about a mutation. This mutation here from F
is thought to have formed in West Asia 48,850 years ago. You can check the entire Y-DNA path by clicking the card top right. The letter moving along the arrow is the representative single nucleotide polymorphism of the haplogroup. It reads SNP, meaning mutation. In this video, the position above the GHIJK has been modified to improve accuracy.
So you can see, obviously getting a good understanding, from F comes the mutation that makes your GHIJK groups, right? So remember that F-M89 or F makes your H's, your I's, your J's, your K's, all those will come from your F groups, right? That's very important. They're going to come right from the F group, be one family. Here's an idea of the breakdown. So GHIJK, obviously make sure G, and then make sure HIJK. From your HIJK, you get your H. Also a IJK. From your IJK, you get a K and an IJ. Right? Your K is going to make a lot of those R's and T's and whatnot. So that's going to be, as you can see, that's K M9. So M9, that's K-M9. That's what it's put in there. So very, very important just to understand the ultimate of that. Let's go down a little bit to get a little fossils of some interesting places where we actually have fossils of F. Here's an interesting place where we know F actually moved into. I'm going to show right here. So here's a place right here. How you say that? Bulgaria. Right here. So this is the earliest place that F actually comes from. So F is actually Indo European. So this is F-M89, right? And if you see a quick little breakdown of F-M89, right? F-M89, what you can notice is that obviously this lineage that goes here makes your G's. What else does it make? Right? Obviously your F1s, your F2, F3s and whatnot. It also makes your H's, right? From here makes your GHIJK, which makes your G. It makes your HIJK, that makes your H. It makes your IJK, which makes your IJ and K groups. And what K makes is your LT and your K2, which makes your P and your NOs and your MS groups, right? Those are going to all come from F. So very important. So remember, F makes all these, which is your G, your H, your IJ, and your K groups, where your K is going to ultimately make your P, and your P makes your R's, where there comes your R1Bs and your R1A. So no R's without F. No J's without F, right? No, none of these without F. So F is actually a grandfather lineage of all these, right? We also know that because we have different writings from different geneticists that will confirm that as well. But this is also important that we understand that it gives us a full understanding of it. So it just gives us what's going on there about the group, but it lets us know also that it makes those GHIJK groups, right? Just talks about some of those groups that's going to obviously be its family. Let me just close this because now we don't need that. Let's go back over here or back over here. So that's important. It just let us know the first place. And where does it go? It makes a jump, right? Because remember that F-M89 had mtDNA of M, but then it makes a jump. It makes a massive jump all the way to China. So it went from here and all of a sudden it went all the way over here, all the way to China, right? So that's going to be very important to note with F, that it makes a move to China. It also goes to Jordan. It also goes to the areas of Jordan. F-M89 in the pre-pottery Neolithic B goes into the areas of Jordan. So that's going to be very important to know. F-M89. So if F-M89 makes all these extra lineages, then F-M89 is a head lineage. And we also notice that it goes into this area. Let's go back a little bit. So that's going to be very important to know that it goes from Europe to China to Jordan to Spain to Hungary, Germany, right? It even goes over the seas at some point. It starts to go over the seas to Canada. So you can see right here, Canada, right there. It's going to go over the seas. So it's going to go here over the seas into the areas of Canada. So you can see what's going on there. So we got some movement. So F is actually very massive. F is one of the lineages that you got to look into very carefully because its totality shows that, yeah, it was in areas of Israel. It was areas in Europe, different areas all around. You can see right here, Megiddo, right there. So that's about 14 BC. So you'll say 3,450 years before present. So take 2,000 off, that's 14 BC. Just to get a good understanding of here, these are ancient times, but still considered times that if this lineage, this F-M89, this F-M89 exists there, this mutation, right, can't be ignored, that this mutation actually makes everything underneath it, which is all your IJK groups, right? So very, very important. That's going to come from this family, right? We had talked about it before in other papers, like this one that says just going to jump right here. The family of haplogroup from F through T, right? F through T. That's very important. That means just like your haplogroup F, including everything that F makes, like T, right? Because LT comes from F, ultimately, is largely the Europoids or Caucasoid family. See what it said there? It let us know that the F group is actually one family of the Europoids, or what is called the Caucasoids, right? And it just says most of the bearers of these haplogroups remain Europoids. However, some populations have acquired racial features of the prevailing races in a given region, right? Think about your people from the Australia islands and stuff like whatnot. The people over there, a lot of them have K groups and S groups, but they look fairly dark skinned. So that's what they're saying. Like even someone with the same father's line can end up developing certain facial features that may not look like they might be a Europoid, but they're still Europoids because the genetics will still lead them right to their root, to who they would be. So that's very important. We had talked about that when we was going over a lot of the information on the origins of people from one of the studies right here. Pretty sure this is re-examining the Outer Africa theory and the origins of Europoids, Caucasoids in light of DNA genealogy. So that was out of the Academy of DNA, right? Genealogy in Newton, USA. So that just goes over some of the roots of this of the total family, where R comes from, where T comes from, and where J comes from. They're all one family, right? They're ultimately one family, which will have a special node. We also know that A groups don't make these groups, right? We even that when they talked about the A haplogroup, when they would talk about the A haplogroup doesn't actually make that group, because what they did, they isolated an R and they wanted to see if A can actually make that group, right? And they found out that A cannot actually make R because it doesn't have the same mutations. But what makes R is actually F, that we know F can actually make R, right? Because we talked about that before when we was going into it and everything, right? You can see right here, in other words, all the SNPs or SNP have been identified, which should be found according to the polygeny of R1A, but SNPs of the all examined subclades of haplogroup A. So it's saying from all the A groups, A1A, A1B, A1 is saying that from all examined subclades of A were completely absent. So that's important to know that A doesn't actually make R groups, but F makes R, but A does not. So that's important. We talked about that before, that A and B groups don't make CT groups. So we talked about this, right? Why is that important? Because you got to know what is Ham, Shem, and Japheth. A and B is Ham, D and E is Shem, and CF groups actually make the whole totality of Japheth, which is the largest branch is under F-M89. So remember that A doesn't make your R group. So A and R are not going to be making each other. So that means R doesn't make your A groups. So that's important to note. How does A actually make stuff? Because A and B doesn't actually make anything under CT. That's very important. So if you ever see anyone connect A and B to any of the CT lineages, they got a problem. They don't understand how A and B doesn't make your CT lineages, that mutation doesn't work like that. So that's important to know. Usually you'll see that a lot of people, even Jensen's work, you'll see he'll separate A and B from your R lineages, but he'll make a problem and try to connect that A and B with your D and E, which is actually under CT, which causes a problem. That's why you'll notice on his chart, he'll put F as a Hamite because he's forcing a split, right? We'll talk about that as we go on. You got to be careful where you put the split, right? The split's going to make a major difference for these things to get a good understanding of it. So understanding A doesn't make R is very important. So that's just something. It goes more into it, goes onto more of it, showing none of the SNPs from A. This whole little part right here and this part right here is actually a geneticist breaking down that the SNPs in A cannot make a R. they show that basically the SNPs in A do not come from or do not make R groups. So they go over that whole little thing. They do a big old thing on that, but they let you know that A and B are connected, but not to your CT groups, right? It just talks about some of those things on this thing. Watch what it says right here. I'll just say it real fast so you can see I'm telling the truth. Watch what it says. Just goes on and says, described in this study are compatible with each other. I'm just going to talk about where it says. It indicates that non-African people, bearers of haplogroup from C to T, right? That's what CT is. CT is the lineages from C to T, right? And what do I mean lineages from C to T, right? Let me just open up a family tree thing. Because probably important to visualize it. And I'm gonna start look at things that's posted. Shalom, shalom, family. That's right. I was looking at what one of the brothers was put in there because I was curious on some of these. But before I touch on that, before I make it too confusing, let me just point this out because we'll touch on some of those things. I'm gonna touch on those. All right, so you can see right here. So real fast, what is it saying? Again, it's saying non-African people, bearers of haplogroup from C to T. So what's in between C to T? So CT right here. So it's saying that these A's, right? These A's and B's don't make CT. So anything on CT is not connected with A and B. That's very important. So genetically, A and B does not make anything under CT, right? So that means this is one family. Now we can see if we can find two. How can we separate these two lineages that are under here? Can we make two lineages under here? Yes, we can. Absolutely. We have two lineages, which is CF and DE. Not very important to understand. It does not go like this. A and B, CF and DE, one family. That's not how it works. Right? That's not how it works. That's very important, right? That's kind of Jensen's idea is that you'll see that he'll make A and B, C and DE one family. That's not how it works, right? And then you can't just open up a CF group and split them somehow. That's not how it works. We note that CT is not made, so that CT is different than A and B lines here, CF and DE. So remember, what did it tell us? Again, you can see right there that non-African people, bearers of haplogroup C to T, do not descend from the African haplogroups A or B. One more time. What's it saying? All the lineages under C and T, which includes all of these, which is from your C groups, way down to your T groups. So that's why it's called CT. That's actually why it's called CT, because it contains SNPs for making C to T groups, which means your C, your DE, your all the way to T groups, right? So CT actually has SNPs that makes everything underneath it. But remember, A and B doesn't make CT. You saw what we just did there? Based on genetics, A and B does not make CT. That's very important. So just let you know when it talks about some of those things that the out of Africa concept, by connecting people by A and B groups, one, doesn't connect genetically like that. And also, two, deeper than that, we know it doesn't even start in Africa, right? It just even said it's likely not in Africa. But let's go on. Let's continue on because we had conversations of that before. Continuing on this build, we know that now we know A and B doesn't make these CT lineages. It's extremely important. It's extremely important that we understand that we don't try to bend the data. But we know that the out of Africa concept of trying to make people come from A and B or make everyone originally was an A group, then somehow became something else. We know that's not true. We know that at the same time, while A and B existed, the CF groups, which makes your R and your J's and your T's existed, and also your DE YAP groups existed. So these three families existed. These three major lineages existed. So that's going to be very important. obviously having they all come from a genetic atom, which actually links to your biblical Noah. So that's going to be very important. But like Ham doesn't make Japheth and Shem doesn't make Ham, we got three lineages that don't make each other. So that's very important to understand real fast. But back to your F-M89, because that's going to be a lineage that actually makes things under it, right? It's going to be a lineage that actually makes things under it. Just to show you, let me see if I can find one real fast, a unrooted chart. Shouldn't be too hard. I want to show you. Let's see. I'll just go to one of my notes just to point this out on a unrooted chart. Because looking at it without the root, you notice how the separations of these lines are, right? And we can notice which family in total is actually Japheth. What's the total family of Japheth and everything. Let me just wait till this thing opens up real fast and then go to a note here just to point out something. I need to go to, whoops. I need to go to search one here. Right here. Pull up the tree that I already have. Because sometimes, trying to refine a lot of these sources, it could be complex. So I like to have them all already established and everything saved. Just like find an unrooted chart, which should have been the first thing. Let me show you real fast, because it is kind of important to know about how lines are separated. Let me just go to, all right, here it is. Just to show you the full understanding. So here's the split. The split is actually in the middle. Let me go to one of these that a little more plain. So it's a little more clear, I think. That one's clear, but for the sake of it, find one that's a little more plain. All right. There it is. So remember how I always go over these? This when you see a chart that looks like this, it's called a circular mode. If you see a chart that looks like this, it has a branch like this, it's a normal mode, which I don't know why Jensen uses a normal mode on his. I don't know why he doesn't just show it on an unrooted chart, because it probably might change things around if he uses an unrooted chart. But here's an unrooted you want to use. You want to use an unrooted chart because it's going to give the clearest picture. But here it is. Let me just show you. This is from the 1,000 Genomes Project that actually took the families and noted what was monophylactic and whatnot. So notice something really interesting on here. Notice something really interesting. You can actually notice that there's going to be a split here. So you got to note where you're going to put your split. Are you going to put your split here? Or are you going to put your split here? Well, you only have one place you can put your split, and it has to be at C. It has to be at C. Why does it have to be at C? Because we know that there's a separation from A and B and your C to T groups. So that means the split can't be, you can't just put the split wherever you want. You can't put it here. You can't put it here. You got to put it right here. You got to put the split right here. What does that mean? That means that C is its own line with F, because C and F actually are going to be related on when you look at the pinpoint of it, which is that's what we were looking at. And you can also note right here, D and E are going to be related. So they're going to split from here. So D and E, obviously different than your C, and then your A and B is different than your D and E. And these ones, they're different. But notice something interesting when you go further onto this branch here. If you notice, what you will see is a F, a large F group circling around these. F actually, what's interesting about this is that F actually is the head of this whole group. Notice this line here. This line here means they're all related. So that stem there stems out from F-M89 and makes one total family, right? Because we can look at the information for that. Again, you can see right there. It says the family of haplogroup from F through T is largely Europoid or Caucasoid family. So what does that mean? Going back to over there, that means that what we're looking at here is actually we're looking at this R, this N, this O, this T, this I and this J, this L, this H and G are under F. They're one family. They're actually going to be sons of Japheth. They're all going to be one of the same family, right? That's very important because I guarantee you can name one of these, at least one of these, as Japheth. There's no doubt. I guarantee you, if you look at sources, you will find that at least one of these are Japheth, right? If not all of them, right? I can give you sources that will prove that all of them are Japheth. But you yourself, by searching history, and if you knew about like some of these genetic letters, you can prove that these are Japheth, or at least one of them. There's dozens of people who can prove R is Japheth. I guarantee you people can prove I is Japheth, right? A lot of these lineages are highly Japheth, right? It's very important, all the way to ancient stock. So that's very important. But they're all one family. All we need to do is prove one of these is Japheth. That's it. And then you can prove the whole thing. We know that Jensen actually proves I and J is Japheth and Indo European. He also just proved H as Indo European, right? So it's a lot of things that has to be understood about this monophylactic family. That's one node, one clade, right? That's going to be one stock, right? Sons of Japheth. That's very important. Coming from one stem, right? Scientifically, biblically, is all sound, right? Because a Hamite, right? A Hamite can't make R. So that means a Hamite can't make a Japhethite. That's biblically sound. A Hamite cannot make a Japhethite, right? We also know that obviously you can't make a Shemite either. So that's very important. But let's understand a little bit about this family of Japheth, this large family of Japheth that comes from F-M89. That's very important to understand. So let's go over here a little bit and kind of talk a little bit about some historical things real fast. But before we even do that, let's touch on what some of the brothers are saying here. So I was looking at what he was saying here. I'm going to read it real fast. According to Y-DNA study and Hansen L at 2008, about 47 of the Nigeria, Cameroon, Nigeria. Yep. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense because that is also what we found in some of the Bantu groups, that the Bantus also had R1Bs in them. They had R1B1s in them. They had R1B1s. So that makes perfect sense that we find R1Bs in some of those lines in Africa. That makes perfect sense. And remainder, yep. The remainder being E1B1A makes perfect sense. And that's what I was talking about. For some reason, it's almost like it was made. If you look at the genetics carefully, you can notice that your R lineages are constantly moving around with your E lineages. So that's something that's also important to note, that it kind of got a movement. But also other lineages move around with those E lineages. So that's also important to note as well. E1B1B moves around with more of those other lineages like T's and H's. And some RV88. E1B1A, I found a lot with R1A or R1B1. So I found a lot of E1B1As moving around with them and whatnot. So that's just something to note as well. But there it is. That means study has done in the year of 2008. So that points to the tribe as Eurasian, which is Japheth. That's right. And that just shows, as these different areas are filled with lineages that basically come from places that are controversial, right? Like, for example, our lineage being found older in Africa than any of the E1B1A groups. That's actually important to note because that lets us know that, one, we should look into the information a little more careful. So that's a great point that you actually made there, because R1B is Japheth. That's actually true. That is true. And that's what we're looking at today, is that sometimes we find the SNPs or the the S and Ps in areas that might be controversial at first, but when we trace them to their root, it makes perfect sense. So that was a great statement that you put there, because that's basically true. We know that we do have some Japhanites in Africa, but they're originally Eurasian. So that's very important. And they also moved around with some of the lineages of E1 or the E1B1 groups, which actually have lineages ties to also upper areas. So that's something to note as well. So you can note something very interesting. Let me close this. We don't need this now, or this. And we'll go back over here. All right, so this is a quick summary of F. So we just got a quick couple of different summaries of F and everything, and it just talks about F develops in certain areas and everything. We can go a little more deeper into it. We can go into some of the subclades of G and other clades and whatnot, how they're connected, how we have those SNPs to prove that they're related, to prove that they're actually related. Another way that they're related is something we're going to look at. We're going to look at some history. Let's look at some history. Talking about the Hittites and everything and all those things. You know what's not really taught in some of the talking of genetics, especially when it comes to the importance of the Levant, is the Sea Peoples invasion. So remember how I was talking earlier about the Coraxis culture and basically some ties that they had and everything with some things, and how I was talking about how that culture actually was an Indo European group. Also on here, see if it just mentions it right on here. Not on here, but they're going to have ties to the Sea Peoples invasion. Let's go over something real fast, over some real history. Let me just point something out on these before we look at this history real fast. So obviously, talking about modern people today, we can notice a very interesting contribution to ancient people who came from areas of Europe, right? When we think about the Sea Peoples invasion, let me just open this up. All right. So remember we was talking about the Levant? Now, this is what we got to know about the Levant. A lot of nations still had the original names of Hamites, right? Canaan is a name of a son of Ham, right? As we can see here, Ham. Obviously, the Philistines, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, right? All those things, and obviously the Canaanites, these Knights, and that's gonna let us know that these families is one family. But we know that there is an Indo European invasion that happens, and also a change of genetics in the land. That's going to be very important to note, and that's also what we're going to point out real fast. All right, so you can see when going over, so the Sea Peoples behind the Philistines were Aegean, right? We're going to look at something that's interesting and to note. Not just going to be one line that's there, but a couple. And remember, we can link them as a monophylactic family by one family, right? So here's just some genetics that they found there. They found some J's, they found some R's, they found some BTs, they found some L's. And it's important to know what they're actually relating here. They're not just saying that they're in the Levant and they always been in the Levant. They're telling you that they came from the Aegean. That's actually what they're saying. They're saying that their lineages can be traced back to areas of the Aegean and areas where you have the Greeks and everything. So very important to know about this real fast. So it just goes over certain lineages. Obviously, your R lineages that came into that area, as well as your J lineages that go into that area that it talks about here for the Greeks. Let me make sure I just point that out real fast. Greeks. Right. Here, this one's okay, but I'll just point out here. Here it is. You can see right here, Minoans and Haplogroup J, right? In the Aegean, it is probably evident that the population changed language, right? Change what? Language, partly through the culture diffusion, right? Probably elite, right? Domination of Proto-Greek speakers, right? So it's letting you know what happened in the Anatolia change after the people from the Aegean came down, and the linguistics change. Whether that happened before the invasion into the Greek peninsula or after it is unclear. We discussed recently because we only have one reported Y chromosome haplogroup among Mycenaeans, and it is J. Now, do we only have one report of that lineage among them? No, we have actually quite a lot. We have quite a lot. We talked about it when we talked about the ancient Scythians, when we found JP58. We talk about when we talk about other lines in different areas. We talked about how we know that the mixture in it also has a Neanderthal mixture. Why is that important too? The Neanderthal mixture, because the Neanderthal admixture is exactly the same. Every line, every family under IJK have exactly the same Neanderthal admixture, and the only way they can have that said Neanderthal admixture if their father's line, if they all came from the same father, and he picked up that mixture, and all the children would have that same mixture. You see what I'm saying? So that's very important. That means that they had to be all one, to all have the same mixture. That's very important. There's other places, there's other finds that we had talked about into areas of from the Aegean that we had looked at some of the ancient Canaanites and where they came from. Just gonna skip a little ahead over here. Also connect the mtDNA is important as well. I'm gonna skip this one. And we're gonna look at the hay real fast just to get the full picture of this family. Even though there's different groups, you'll see T groups, you'll see G groups, you'll see J groups, you'll see R groups. But what I'm gonna show you is that they're ultimately one family. And I'm gonna show you how they're Indo European, just to kind of make it clear and understandable. Just for the so let me just this one. That's just something. I'm just gonna look here before I go to this history real fast, because we're gonna dive in a little bit into some history that basically gives the full understanding on where the sea people came from, how they lived before they even got into the Levant, and how we know that they would be one family, a Indo-European family that later invaded the Levant. That's very important. But remember, when we talked about the Hittites, we know that they also have evidence of an invasion almost 1,000 years ago. But that's just to know in itself that they had a invasion based on the scientific scale long time ago. Long story short. All right, so here it is. Let's kind of leave this here. I'm just gonna leave this one right here because it's gonna be something for a. It's gonna make. All right. Yep. This is what I want right here real fast. This is information because it just lets us know about the 18th dynasty pharaoh that had a J line. That's why is that important? We're gonna go over all these things. It's all these things are gonna connect. It's all important. We'll go back. We'll come back to this, right? So very important to know that we had an Egyptian pharaoh with a J, and also we know also that pharaoh died by arrow wound because it got some more information on that one. But I'm just gonna make sure I leave it right. Let's see where I want to leave it at. Right here for now. Right here, I guess. All right. So let me open up one more thing just to make it clear. Right here. All right. Now let's talk about the history. Then we're going to talk about some of the history of what is called what I call the mountain people and everything. Some interesting little history of these things. In fact, let me open up on another. I'll just put it up here. All right. We'll get into the history. Put this tab here because I like it when it's blacked out like that. All right. Now let's get into. I put something in this little when I was talking with Jargon about the book Trace, because I think it's something worth talking. Claim that we can find, right, genetically, scientifically, it's supposed to be defendable, but I disagree that it's defendable. But remember how I was talking about how, remember, in the book Trace, he does confirm that IJ as not just Indo European, but Hittites, right? But also J group, as you can see right here in your Y-DNA haplogroup J1, Y6, which this is actually a root J. Let me just show you why is it important that I'm showing you this one. It's not just in a random, it's not J, right? I'm just showing you any J when I'm showing you this. I'm showing you the root of J, right? You can see right here, you can see it will come from your IJK, from your IJ, from your J, from a J1. This is actually your root. Notice if I click J1, this is your root of your J1. So every J1 has this mixture in it because it's going to come from this, from your 6313. So that's going to be important. From your root J, we know that in the root of all J lineages, J1, know that, as it says, about 1.7 to 2.4 of pretty much the ones that was found in a certain area in the Caucasus Mountain, which was about like 10,000 years ago, almost oldest than the Tufians. In the individuals' DNA was Neanderthal in origin. You see what it's saying there? So it lets you know that and this from a study right here, it lets you know that that lineage has Neanderthal in origin. Now that's one thing, but also relate that with Isham. Relate that with UST Isham. Isham has a K2 group, which makes your M, N, O, P, Q, and R groups, right? So that's also a ultimate node. And notice it has exactly the same mixture, almost the exact same mixture. Look at how much it has. So this one has obviously that 1.7. Also, this has a 1.7, right? Peaking at the 2 point such and such, right? Is peaking up there. So you can see a good understanding of that. That is saying Isham has the same admixture. I just thought that was important because it's going to let us know another way that these families are related. But let's go into some quick science real fast. I want to show you the science before the Israelites come out of the lands of Egypt. We had the ancient DNA genetic origins of early age Philistines. So now we're going to find out who these Philistines are. It's important to know that the Philistines are actually Indo European people. In fact, they say right here, DNA reveals Indo European roots of ancient Philistines. You see what it's saying? So understand, we're just talking science. That's all we're talking. We're just talking sources. Just going to bring the sources out. Look what it says. DNA reveals European roots of ancient Philistines. It just talks about 3,000-year-old burial and everything. Enemies of the biblical Israelites. I didn't say that. It's saying that, letting you know that the Philistines, they say they're Indo-European. They call them the enemies of the biblical Israelites, right? A sure legends of Bronze Age migration. So it's going to give us a sure up legend of the Bronze Age migration. But also remember, it's letting us know that this group that's moving around isn't just going to be, we're not going to just say that this is just going to be Hamites or whatever. We're going to know what lineages is actually in them. We actually know that it's going to be Indo-European that's going to be mixed in with them. So that's going to be important. So this just gives us some information on those things. So it just talks about those Philistine, and it's going to let know about where they came from. It lets us know, obviously, they came from areas and everything. We're going to look at some of the that they have in them, get a full understanding of it. We're going to go through the history of it, and I'm going to play a little video. Ancient DNA sheds light on the genetic origin of early Iron Age Philistines. We know when we talk about some of the places, look what the connections they have. Remember, we talked about Indo-European group that came here. The Caucasus Mountains had Indo-Europeans. We know that there was Indo-European groups that were settled in these areas, and then they moved into these areas. So that's very important. So they're going to move into these areas, but notice they're not in Mesopotamia, right? Because actually they don't enter into Mesopotamia until later, but they start to settle in areas of the Levant and areas around these areas. So remember, in the Indo-European invaded area of the Hittites and everything. So this, and notice that we got a harmony. We know history. We know that this is historically true. We know that it's genetically true. So we're seeing genetics and history kind of match together. If now we're gonna look more pinpoint on the actual snips of what we find there. So here's just some highlights from there. Resemblance between the new culture traits and the 13th century patterns found in the Aegean. So that's how they connect them. They're connecting the ones in the Levant to the Aegean. So they know that the people in the Levant came from the Aegean, have led some scholars to explain this so-called Philistine I said that weird. This Philistine event, right? Or phenomenon, how you say that, by a migration from an Aegean-related source. So you see what it's saying there? So it's letting us know, remember, Aegean, that's obviously going to be in areas of Europe. That's what we were just looking at earlier from right here. Remember, we was talking about that. You see this J group and whatnot, R groups and whatnot. Remember, it told us that on here. See, it said the sea people behind Philistines were Aegeans, including R's and obviously J's and all that and that. Because it's actually a couple different lineages that we got to look into to note what's actually all there. It's got a couple different lineages that's actually mixed there. Right? That's why we're looking at of the sea people, such as the Philistines. And remember, we had talked about how they were a mix of the Coro-Araxes culture and things like that. So we had talked about some of those things. But now let's get back over here. All right, so going on, potentially associated with the sea peoples. So you see Philistines, they talk about from the Aegean, they say they're Indo European, and they say that they're sea peoples. A population that is thought to have settled in other parts of coastal Eastern Mediterranean, right? Of the coastal areas of Mediterranean. And then it says ancient DNA sheds light on the, obviously we talked about that, genetic origins of early Iron Age Philistines, the Canaanites of biblical times. So that's very important to know. So when the Most High was talking to Abraham and talk about the Canaanites, we got to know is when did Abraham exist? Bronze Age. Who were the Canaanites of that time? This is going to be them. But let's get a little more understanding into the group. Now I'm going to show you who exactly are those groups, pinpoint, and I'm going to show you the history behind them. So remember I told you about the Coro-Araxes group that I said it came down here. When we talk about some of that, let me just point that out real fast. All right, so right here, you can see right here where it talks about some things with regards to the timing of these archaeological points to culture affinities between, right? Affinities, right? Very important. That means it's short connections between the Coro-Araxes, the Caucasus, right? And this other culture from the Levant. So it's connecting the Caucasus and the Levant. So it's letting you know individuals from the Caucasus Mountains, right? And we should know where that is. That's just upper areas of, where you see Georgia and stuff. Caucasus Mountains is actually a name after a mountain. That's why sometimes you'll see those people in the Caucasus Mountains called Caucasians. Really, honestly, not every Caucasian, because mountains that rather they should be called Japhanites, because nowadays you'll hear a lot of people who are light skinned called Caucasians. But that's not based on genetics. That's based on ethnics, not based on actual origins, based on modern ideas. But here's where they would come from. It's letting you know that they were. That's going to be we also are looking at that on here. That's the Coro-Araxes culture that was right there in the mountains. So they're going to be coming, so making some invasions downwards. And back to this, you can see right here. So obviously the Coro-Araxes, the Caucasus, and obviously connections with Levant. And how long ago? Almost 5,000 years ago, right? Archaeological cultures in the first half of the 3rd millennial BC. So that's a long time. That's important to consider when going over the biblical information. So it lets us know that they obviously are non-Semitic and everything, Hurrians and other things like that. That's important. It's more stuff on the Coro-Araxes culture, on their connection, that they know that they're going to have connections there. real fast. Let's keep on keeping on. So what we're actually looking at here, right? Obviously, look at the Coraxis culture. You got J2, you got J1, you got G2, you got R1b, and you got I. What family is that? That's Japheth. Every single family that I just told you, from G to I to J to R, is from F-M89. All that is from one family, right? A list here. Just keep reflecting it back to like this, to it's engraved and understood that even though you're seeing multiple different haplogroups, you're seeing one family. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing one family. There's going to be one family line from one source, which is CF from F-M89, right? So here's your CF. It's going to be CFP143, and it makes your C and your F-M89, which is all these lineages underneath it. Leave it right here. We're going to come back to it. So remember, from CT right here, from CT comes CF and DE. But under CF is going to be a family tree. Under F-M89 is going to be your major family tree. From your GHIJK is going to come your Gs, and we're going to see some of these lineages under here, like your I and J groups. That's going to be very important to note. Go over this. Let's go back to what we were just looking at. These and this one. And I just let that open up real fast before I click this. So this little thing is at least open before we go to another piece. Or I'll let it load by itself. All right, so go back over here. So there we're looking at, that's one family in the Coraxis culture. Now, what we also got a note here is a certain group that's going to give us some keys to things, right? I'm just going to go over. Maybe we talk about the Hittites, who was in the area of the Hittites, the Indo Europeans. Anatolia, who's going to be in that area, the Hittites. What do we have? Everything from F-M89. Your G's, your H2, there's your H2, I, J, R, and T. So you want to see that on Jeanson's design, but there is a fossil of H2 in the areas of the Hittite land. So obviously he does know that they are Indo-European. Your H is found to be Indo-European. And we know an Indo-European group invaded in this area. That would be one family. So that's very important to know. Let's go over a little more. That's just kind of giving ideas of what it is. Let me see which one. Make sure this is it, I think. All right. So this is what I wanted to point out. I just wanted to point out a little bit about this culture right here. Why is it important with this culture? Because this is going to be where the pinpoint area of the Sea peoples came from. I'm going to show you exactly 100% where the Sea peoples pinpoint came from. Just to kind of make that clear, I just need to point out these genetics on here so you can see this one. All right, so right here, this is the part where I want to show you. This area is right here. You see this area here? This is when you think of the Aegean, this is the Aegean right here. And in this area right here, in the Neolithic time frame, right, we're talking past, based on the scientific scale, past 5,000, 6,000 years ago, right? And obviously that's taking the scientific scale. But understanding that you're going to see a group that's going to be in this area. And notice the lineages that we find there. We find G2, we find C, right? Let me make sure this is, I'm actually looking at I think I'm looking at the one. Let me actually, in fact, I think I'm looking at the wrong one real fast. It's not this one. Let me make sure I'm looking at it. It's actually not that one right there. The spelling is a little off. As soon as I seen the mirror is missing, so I was like, no, that's not it. Let me go to the right one, because it's gonna basically be those same ish lineages. I just gotta make sure I point it out on here exactly the one that it is, because it's only one of these. Let me just go over to it. All right. Somewhere on one of these, I just want to point it out for you so you can see the whole little results that they have. At least I think it's on one of these. Otherwise, I'll just find it and point it out real fast. But this is already made sure I'm marked down those lineages. It's G2, J2, R1b, U152, J1, and T1 groups. These lineages are going to be important because we're going to look at something real fast.
Tin.
We're going to take a look at and get a good understanding of what's going on in this culture. Let me make sure I copy this real fast and just save this over here. All right. Just put it on here. And I want to make sure I point. You can see those lines, which let's try it one more time. Let's see. Yeah. All right, so here it is. Here it is. This gotta be it. Yep. So you want to see? So you can see this is gonna be about the transition right before lights come out, right? So remember, where the Israelites between 2000 to 1000 BC, right? We know Abraham leaves Ur, right? He goes down through Canaan to Egypt, go back up, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we can't 100% verify because they talk about how their tombs are closed. But we know, where does the Israelites develop for 400 years or said such is in the lands of Egypt. So we know that they're going to develop in the lower lands of Egypt. So that's going to be very important. Also, what we need to know is that we're going to look at a certain culture here to verify who are not the genetic Israelites. It's in this culture right here. I don't know if I'm going to say it right. Terramar and Canegrate. Great culture. And you can notice what's in there: R1b, your G2, your J2, J1, and T. Now let's see what's going on here with this culture here. So this is just something else with a bunch of different culture. But let's go and learn the about sea peoples. Now we're going to actually break it about this culture that we were just talking about right here with these lineages. And we're going to find out who are the Indo European sea peoples with a fullness. And we're going to break down this whole little video.
In Bronze Age North Italy, there thrived a fascinating people known today as the Terramar culture. They lived in houses elevated above the earth on piles, in villages protected by banks and ditches. They raised animals and grew a variety of crops, and they were skilled bronze workers. They were also warriors armed with long swords, and were at the centre of a Europe-wide trade network in copper, tin, and amber. And then, in about 1150 BC, quite suddenly, they disappeared. The same era as the Late Bronze Age collapse, when the mysterious they disappeared. This was the same era as the Late Bronze Age collapse, when the mysterious sea peoples invaded the Near East and destroyed so many ancient civilizations, leading to the first Great Dark Age in history. So were the people of the Terramar culture involved in some way? Were they also the victims of climatic changes and foreign invasions that wiped them out? Or were they perhaps one of the perpetrators? Could they in fact have been amongst the sea peoples? This is the mystery of the Terramar culture. Terramar is the name given to an archaeological culture located mainly in the Po Valley in northern Italy that thrived between about 1650 BC and 1150 BC. Its name comes from the deep layers of black earth where their settlements used to be. Like many ancient settlement sites all over the world, These sites grew into mounds over the generations as the ordinary waste from living, farming and raising animals grew beneath their feet. Within the quadrangular boundary ditches and banks surrounding these villages, the ground level rose over the centuries. Black earth, several meters thick, rich in organic material, was harvested by 19th century Italian farmers to be used as fertilizer for their own fields and gardens. There are more than 60 of these villages known today, stretching from the mouth of the Po River to the hills north of the plain. Their houses were often built on piles, on stilts. They did this in villages where the ground was wet or liable to flood, but they also did it on dry ground. Some villages also had houses with floors at ground level, while others in the same village were on piles, and it's not known why this was done. One suggestion is that these people originated in wet landscapes and carried on that building tradition even when they moved to drier places. In the early period of this culture, these small villages, usually no bigger than 2 hectares or 5 acres, were close to one another across the landscape, often just 2 kilometers or a mile or so away from the filled with water, rerouted from nearby rivers, and were a way of retaining precious water resources. Medieval period onwards, but it is unusual for the Bronze Age and conveys the sense of a well-ordered society. They were otherwise a quite typical late Bronze Age European warrior society, similar to the contemporary tumulus culture to their north. Around 25% of their graves were of elite individuals, the men buried with swords and daggers, and the women with pairs of pins with amber beads. When necessary, the rest of the male population may have been called on to fight by their ruling class, probably with bows and spears, but their status in life as farmers, herders and craftsmen was reflected in their lack of grave goods. The Terramar had close links with southern Germany and Hungary, as well as the cultures of the eastern Mediterranean, especially the Mycenaeans. There is a huge amount of material evidence demonstrating these connections, but the most striking of all, to me at least, is the fact that the Terramar used 2 systems of weights and measures. One was that of Central Europe, and the other was from the Aegean. The period from 1700 BC to about 1150 BC saw the development of a complex trade system linking the urban civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East with other societies further afield, from the Indus Valley in the east to the Atlantic coast in the west, the Horn of Africa in the south, and the Baltic in the north. Resources like copper and tin were mined in places like Britain and Iberia, and then transported step by step along well-established trade routes by land, river and sea into the Mediterranean. But this enormous integrated system, although long-lasting, was complex, and it was not always peaceful. For example, peoples in the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe traded horses and other goods with the civilizations to their south across the Caucasus, but they also raided and even conquered them, like the Indo-Iranian chariot warriors that established the Mitanni kingdom in the heart of Syria. Likewise, the Mycenaean Greeks started out on the periphery of the more ancient kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, in many ways a cultural and economic satellite of the Minoans of Crete, before eventually conquering the people they had long emulated, taking over their monopoly on Aegean maritime trade. And during the late Bronze Age, and one might say at all times in world history, trade and conquest were 2 sides of the same coin. But long-standing trade routes can also lead the peoples on the periphery back into the centre, as we shall see shortly. The Terramar people did not have enormous copper deposits to mine, nor did they have a huge urban population of voracious metal consumers like the civilizations to the east, but they were located in an important position within this international trade network, linking southern Scandinavia to the Mycenaean trade network in the Mediterranean. Here in the Po Delta, there is evidence of extensive Mycenaean contact. And not only were exchanges made here, there were Mycenaeans actually living here, potters almost certainly, and probably also merchants and colonizers, facilitating the trade with their other outposts in the western Mediterranean, on Sicily and Sardinia, and even perhaps Iberia. In this system, incredibly valuable Baltic amber passed from Denmark into southern Germany and down into the Po Valley. These Terramar-based Mycenaeans also facilitated trade in copper from Sardinia and Iberia north into Germany and ultimately to Scandinavia. We know this in part because lead isotope testing shows that much of the enormous quantity of bronzes in this period of the Nordic Bronze Age was made from copper mined in Iberia and Sardinia. These networks were kept together by treaties, dynastic marriages, and political alliances between the chiefdoms and kingdoms along the route, which in turn provided political security for travelling warriors and traders. And although local warfare always contained a risk to the system, the benefits of maintaining stable alliances prevailed, at least for a while. Interestingly, there is a link between the Bronze Age Tell cultures in Hungary and the Terramar. In 1500 BC, these Hungarian cultures collapsed, and some of their inhabitants migrated to the Po Delta, where they became part of the expanding Terramar culture, which was organised socially in much the same way as the Hungarian Tell settlements had been. Although it is said the Terramar culture began in around 1650 BC, in fact they underwent enormous demographic growth and cultural change from about 1500 BC because of this mass colonization event from Hungary. We know this because of the appearance of Hungarian-style antler cheek pieces for controlling horses, Hungarian pottery types, and even in the settlement types from that period, and especially in the burials of early Terramar warriors with long bronze sword types, that these people were thriving right in the centre of this European trade network. Well, it must be related in some way to the late Bronze Age collapse, which happened around this time. But where did these people go? The 13th century BC was a rather dramatic period. The stability of the late Bronze Age system was under strain from a whole range of pressures. The power balance between the Hittites and Egypt was heating up, and both sides sought allies and recruited mercenaries from the surrounding areas and further afield. And this was a period of rapid military development. New weapon and armour styles appeared throughout Europe, reflecting the new style of warfare. Sword and spear-armed infantry, protected by round shields, helmets and breastplates, appeared from Britain and Denmark to Iberia and Greece. A highly mobile warrior aristocracy arose, forming the retinues of chiefs and kings, escorting trade caravans, guarding trade centres, and protecting the ships that carried the goods. They also became mercenaries and pirates, preying on cargo ships and threatening trade centres, chiefdoms, and palaces. And this is why fortifications were erected around the palace centres of Mycenaean Greece, like Tyrins, at this time. Mycenaean and Cypriot ships were in regular contact with southern Italy, Sardinia, and the Adriatic, especially the settlement of Fratasina. And through the Terramar, the Mycenaeans had contacts with Central and Northern Europe. So during the instability of the 13th century BC, many of these places were increasingly drawn into the Mycenaean world through a mix of trade, war service as mercenaries, and by the provision of slaves. In this period, Italian-type flange-hilted swords from travelling warriors are found in several places in the East Mediterranean. Along with these swords, the presence of North Italian daggers and early violin bow fibula, a kind of pin used on clothing, shows that it was actually people from northern Italy with all their personal items that were travelling by land and sea into the civilizations that had for so long been at the centre of the Bronze Age world. It wasn't just people from northern Italy, of course. The so-called Sea People, mentioned in famous Egyptian inscriptions and preserved in letters by other regional kings, were from many places. Some of the Sea Peoples were warriors and mercenaries. Some were associated with the sea, while others with the land, and ox-drawn wagons bringing their women and children with them in their migrations. Those mentioned by name are the Peliset, Tejeka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, Sherden, Luka, Karkisha, Ekwesh, and the Teresh. But who were they? Well, scholars have been arguing this for over 150 years, and the discussions will continue into the future. Some, like the Denyen, Wehesh, and Ekwesh, have been identified with the Greeks, the Shekelesh with Sicilians, and the Sherden with Sardinians. But this doesn't mean only these groups were attacking the Near East, and it doesn't mean that the recorded name of a group represented a distinct ethnic group with a single origin. In fact, considering the mobile nature of the European warrior-trader aristocracy of this time, and the nature of mercenaries, it would be surprising if they all did. In the depiction of the sea battle at the great temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt, we get some indications of these invaders. Their intention was supposedly to settle here in Egypt, and some of their ships had characteristic seabird sterns, and swan-headed sterns are well known on ships from Central Europe to the Aegean, shirts like those worn by warriors in the Aegean. This mix of arms and armour is also seen in contemporary figures painted on the famous Mycenaean warrior vase, again reflecting this new European mobile warrior class. And so the Terramar populations could quite plausibly have been among the Sea Peoples. But let's go back to the Po Valley and look at the archaeological explanations for why 120,000 people left in such a short time. As mentioned earlier, these people had been undergoing social changes for generations. A handful of the many small villages became huge, well-defended, high-density population centres, while the rest were abandoned. What would drive people together like that? Well, examination of human remains from one Terramar cemetery shows 16% of the skeletons had lesions from axes, swords, and arrowheads. Considering that not all combat injuries will appear on the bones, this is a remarkably high percentage, and so we can be certain that warfare was endemic in the Terramar culture. The powerful chiefs of this land waged war against one another, perhaps over many generations conquering smaller villages, drawing them together in one place to defend their people and resources from other local warlords. The later villages also had some large-scale buildings, which have been interpreted as warehouses, presumably for the local elites to amass and control the ever more precious grain supplies. Again, there is evidence of this not only here, but across Europe and the Near East. A combination of all these factors and the wider instability in the Eastern Mediterranean led to a joint decision to leave their homeland, taking their people with them, to settle in areas they were already familiar with thanks to their centuries-long trade links, areas such as the Aegean and southern Italy and Sicily. The route taken by these chiefs can be tracked by the appearance in the record in various places of the diagnostic violin bow fibulae worn by these people. The early distribution of these items after the Exodus is mostly in the East Mediterranean, and it matches with the distribution of a type of Italian dark burnished handmade pottery. So we can be fairly sure that many of these chiefs and the populations of their huge settlements crossed the seas in large numbers to mainland Greece, especially the Peloponnese, and also to Crete and Cyprus. In smaller numbers, some of them went on to Western Anatolia and even to Syria. Some chiefs Western Anatolia and even to Syria. Some chiefs took sea routes, while others, thanks to ancient contacts with Hungary and the Balkans, took overland routes. Small numbers went as far as the north coast of the Black Sea. But it seems that the Terramare migration primarily was headed towards the Aegean and Crete, the centre of the ancient trade routes they had so part of. And in some areas, such as Arcadia, there are genuine Italian flange-hilted swords in local, richly furnished graves, suggesting that at least some of these migrating chiefs had succeeded in conquering these lands and becoming local overlords. No doubt these Mycenaean palaces were unprepared for these sudden attacks in great numbers and were taken by surprise. We can think perhaps of the first Viking invasions of England and the sudden inroads made by marauding armies. And somewhat like the Vikings and other historical conquerors, their material and cultural presence declined rather quickly as the colonizers were assimilated by the far larger host civilization. So although the Sea Peoples were undoubtedly made up of many ethnic groups, there is strong evidence to support the idea that the Terramar Exodus represents one of the major events in this period, and could also have been one of the many triggering forces, one which perhaps led to further upheavals and displacements. Imagine a confederation of Mycenaean kings busy waging war across the Aegean against Hittite vassal kingdoms like Wilua and its allies in Anatolia. Real historical events, perhaps remembered as the Trojan War. And while they are so engaged, waves of hostile invaders pour into their undefended homeland, from land and sea, by the north and west. Remember, the population estimates were an exodus of 120,000 people. Even if many relocated in Italy and Sicily, there were still plenty of invaders to cause serious problems for the Mycenaeans. These conquests, and the instability caused by them, might have encouraged some of the Mycenaean population, the Denyen, Wehesh and Ekwesh perhaps, to join this mass raiding further to the east and south rather than staying at home. Perhaps there were Terramar warriors amongst these named groups. And remember that many of the Terramare people moved south into Sicily. This might have been the catalyst driving the Shekelesh from the island eastwards to ultimately attack Egypt. Perhaps Terramare warriors accompanied them too. The remarkable connections between the various cultures of Bronze Age Europe and the Near East are explored in my video about the horned helmets of the Bronze Age, so please click here to watch that video next. Thank you for watching.
All right, you see how I just let that play? Why did I just let that play? Because it was a straight walkthrough. It's pretty much a walkthrough. This video is basically telling you about the mixed company that was over here, that was mixing with these groups and these groups. A lot of these groups were in mixing. And if you just look at those groups, you can see in Italy, you got some G's, some J2s, some J1s, some T's. You can see in that one we was just talking about, the Terramar culture. You can see some R's, some G's, some J2s, some J1s, some T's. You can see all of in these different areas. You can see a lot of these different lines that would definitely be those Indo European lineages. And remember, F-M89 makes all your GHIJK groups. So obviously make sure you separate the E's, which are the original Shemites. Your D is the original Shemites from your F-M89 groups, and the picture becomes crystal clear what you're looking at there. That you're looking at a invasion of what was the first Indo-European groups and what became the lineage that ruled in the Levant, which was actually the Sea Peoples invasion. And remember, we got to also remember, this one doesn't have the Coraxes on here, but we can go to the fossils of the Coraxes called. There's a lot of people. I recommend the Hebrew of Israel. He goes to the separation of the Coraxes culture versus like what would be ancient Levantan cultures. So remember, this is a well-known invasion. The Sea Peoples invasion should not be ignored. The fact of their movements and where they settled is really known. But here I'll show you. Here's a Coraxis Coraxis, right? Coraxis, J2, J1, G2, R, 1B, and I. All those are Indo-European lineages. So we actually have a perfect understanding of Indo-European lineages moving about. They're going to settle in different areas and have dominance in certain areas. So that's going to be very important. But remember, all these areas, they're obviously going to be like I just talked about, mixed and mingled, moving about. But also we can see it right here. If we look up Hittites, I don't think Vincent talks about these things, but that's why we gotta talk about the truth of these things. You can see right here, just to kind of make it clear. Here's what Jason says about the Hittites. Finally, their priestly. Look at what Jason's saying. He says, finally, their priestly JP58 lineage, because some people love to say J is Jews, so he's kind of feeding off of that, is itself a subset of Haplogroup J1. So he's just letting you know that J1 makes later on some of the P58 SNPs. But watch what he says. As we observed in chapter 8, Haplogroup J1 looks like it's connected to the ancient Hittite lineage, which is a branch of the Indo European I and J, right? So, and then it says the Jewish language, Hebrew, which is Afro-Asiatic, that's very important. Hebrew and Aramaic is Afro-Asiatic, does not belong to Indo-European family. That's very important. So Afro-Asiatic is Hebrew and Aramaic, right? Arabic rather. And J is actually Indo-European. That's also what Jensen finds. But you got to be careful with Jensen's work, because I don't know how I think it's because he's an R group. He wants to make R Shemites. A lot of people do that, right? There's something, then they want to make their bloodline something, right? But if we go about it unbiasedly, we can find truth. So that's what my goal is to go about these things unbiasedly, without a bias, but to bring out the perfect truth. So IJ is Indo-European, and guess what? If IJ is Indo-European, IJ is on the same branch that comes from F. If IJ is Indo-European and he's also finding out that H, remember we were talking about that he found out that H is also Indo-European.
Right? H is indeed Indo-European.
Indeed. Then we know that from F-89 is going to be making your G and your H and your I and J, which are Indo-European, and K groups, which are Indo-European. All that family is completely from Japheth, right? And in truth, that the whole family of anything coming from CF or especially F-M89 in the European family, that will be one whole full tree here. So right here, you can see. Let me just go on it one more time on that, because I think it's still loading. All right. I'll just click it. All right. So remember where the split is? Right here. Not here. Not here. Here. Right? That's important. That the split is in the right spot. Where's the split? Not here, but here. Why is that important? Splits this way. That's why it's called a unrooted chart, because it has no root. The centerpiece has no root. Or it's called a star graph, because it comes out like a star, right? It comes out like a star, shoots out like a star, right? It has a centerpiece and everything shoots out. And everything on this branch right here is related. Everything on this branch that's circled around F, everything from F is one family, one node, one clade, all monophylactic, right? So these are going to be all one from CF, from CF, but ultimately from F-M89. So now that we got that understood, now you know why our elder brother Japheth had took the Levant by the time Israel came out, and when you hear names like the Hittites or the Canaanites, things like that, even Mizraim, when you think of Egypt, they're very mixed. Those lands and those areas are very mixed, but more so of the lineage that started to become the most dominant lineage and powerful lineage of all time. The strength of though there's of Israel is obviously in the Most High, not in numbers or in manpower. But if it was manpower by flesh, Japheth is that one that took over the Levant, even from him, right? So even though Africa is the land of Ham, Japheth took a lot of the areas that Hamites first ruled at. So it's still named after their names, but it's not after their genetics. So very important stuff on that. So I already talked about some of these things, right? We found a haplogroup of HIJK and IJK in the Mesolithic and the Paleolithic. We did find those, right? This is, if you haven't seen this one, this is just a talk we had on Trace and everything. Going to still talk about it as he constantly release stuff and whatnot. I should do a separate review on that one that he did on E being, he tried to make E Egyptian, but that's what I was talking about. Israelites was in Egypt. Probably got to look more careful at the fossils to know who is who, if we know that this is Japheth. So very, very important to know. So this just talks about the family. This is just a whole breakdown of the connection. Maybe I'll talk about first the CFP143 common ancient split from DE-YAP. So remember, DE-YAP and CF are brothers, but they split. There's a separation between these lineages. Clarifying the earliest basically separation event outside Africa. Outside Africa. What happened? CF split from DE. Where? Outside Africa. Second, Justice talks about the unidentification of haplogroups. Look what it says here. IJK by M522 and M523 now creates evolutionary distance from F and H, right? Just talks about some different SNPs and everything for these groups, right? So they find the mutations that basically has a good connection, as it says there. It just says, as well as saying the inference that both IJM423 and KT, which is K-M89 or K-M9, arose closer to the Middle East than Central Asia or Eastern Asia, right? So very important stuff. Why is it saying that? Because they are all one. It just goes over and talks about right here, haplogroups G to J, T and L, right? Generally are constrained geographically into Europe. So it tells you that the G to J, T to L are actually constrained to near Europe, the Middle East, of Western Asia, with various extensions, especially to Arabia and India. So you can see what's going on there. So it lets you know what families obviously have ties there. It just talks about the expansion and everything of these lineages and everything. Go back to another piece here. And then it just, talks about other things that we was talking about, how they split in areas of the north, right? I'm just going to skip that one. So that's just understanding on how did Japheth rule the north, and why is it that you want to be careful when you say who are the Hittites, who are even the Hivites, who are the Canaanites, who are the Egyptians, because you want to be careful. By the time of Abraham, the land was highly mixed, especially by the time Israel left out of Israel. So when you see genetics of people in the Levant, you got to make sure you trace it all the way back to its root, right? Because Israel, if you want to trace Israel back to its root, where would Israel develop at? In Africa. How do we know that Israel would develop in Africa? Because right in the biblical narrative, it tells you without a doubt that Abraham went down into Egypt, but then settled in Lower Levant. Isaac went down to Egypt and settled in Lower Levant. We know that Jacob, Israel, went down into Egypt, right? We know Joseph settled in Egypt for a long time, developing with his children, with Ephraim and Manasseh, to about the third generation. He rose them on his knee. We also got his brethren that settled in the lands of Egypt. And then what happened? A long time before the Exodus, they developed in Africa, Egypt. So where should we find this lineage if we want to find out who were the real Israelites? That a lineage should pinpoint to the areas of Egypt, upper areas of Africa, in between the lower areas of Levant. And that's what we see with the Natufian groups, the E1B1 groups, that they actually spread from areas of the Levant, Mesopotamia, and to areas of Africa, Egypt, as we should find as the biblical narrative tells us itself. Not in Europe, right? But that's the point of going over this, so that we can understand who is Japheth, where did Japheth come from. He's a brother of Shem, he's a brother of Ham. But we got to understand the difference between Japheth's family line and a family tree of, said, the Israelites that came out of Africa, which is Egypt, which came out of the Exodus. So that's a difference. So Israel will have evidence of coming out of Africa. Any other line that's not Israelites will show that they came from Europe. If there are the Gentile nations. So that's just important to know, right? Not saying that some could not have mixed in with Israel, but original Israel we found to be your E1B1A groups, right? E1B1 leads to the Israelites and the Shemites. E1B1. So with that, family, questions before I go, let me know. We'll touch on trace another time. I made this a part 1, but I was going to do like a part 2 to it because I felt like it would be kind of long, but these videos are usually long. We might do a part 2 to it. We might dig a little more into Japheth, maybe a part 2, just to get a little more highlights on the details, a little more details on the vast largeness of Japheth, how he fills the north, but still obviously getting a good understanding of his monophylactic families here. So with that, that's all I got for you today, to get a good picture. Now to get a summary of it all, this is what we basically did today. Basically what we did today was that we looked at how the sea people, the area of the Levant has to be understood because the Levant is very controversial. Not every haplogroup you find in the Levant is actually an Israelite or a Shemite, but we got to trace them to their origin and connect their linguistics. So that's very important to understand. We looked at the book Traced a little bit on what it says about some of the Indo European peoples, and we know that Indo European definitely is Hebrew. Hebrew is Afro-Asiatic. So we have to find a group that's largely Afro-Asiatic to find where is that Hebrew group, right? Because Hebrew does not come from Indo European, so that's very important. But IJ is highly Indo European, so it's very important to know. And they are a group of the F-M89 children, which is of Japheth, which is fine. It's okay to be honest. It's just not right to lie, to say that these are Shemites, right? So on that, right? T is not Shemites, R is not Shemites, IJ is not Shemites. F-M89 makes Indo-Europeans. So that's very important. So very, very important stuff. So we looked at trace. We also looked at some information of the core Caucasus, how they had came from obviously the Caucasus Mountains and the Zagros Mountains, and they had settled obviously in the Levant and different areas of Mesopotamia. We had talked about some other as extra information on JP58. That was the one that some was trying to say was priests, but we know it's not. There's no way because they're ancient Indo-Europeans. We can find their liveliness very easy. So just some sources. This one, maybe this will be our part 2. I'll go into the details of who are the mountain people or where is the pinpoint areas of Japheth. Who are the Hurrians, who are the Mitanni, who are the Hittites. A lot of brothers already went over these things, but maybe just give a little secondary opinion on these things, a second insight on some of these things. So obviously a decent amount of information I didn't want to go over right now, but maybe another time we'll go over who these groups and their ties, right? And I talked a little bit of basically the connections of the H group. How do we know that that's in? We talked about how Jensen correct itself, and he told you that, like he said, right here, let him say it himself.
Ending up in Europe. The reason I've told you all this, that I've rethought H, is because if H is indeed Indo-European, that it was in the Ural Mountain north of the Black Sea area in ancient times, and not in India, that is probably not the explanation for the origin of the peoples of the Indus Valley Civilization.
So very important. So he told you himself that he actually sold a book that actually changed his mind on a very critical point, which H is actually Indo European. That makes a very important understanding that we were talking about for monophylactic groups, that all the Indo European lineages come from F-M89, which H comes from that, as well as I and J. So that's important to know. We went over the history of who is this here, which is actually what's the ultimate origins of the sea people. And we looked at their genetics, which their genetics is R1, U1, 5, 2, G2, J2, J1, and T1 groups. So that's been very important. We can find those in multiple different areas. But we also know they was originally in the Coraxis culture. We know they was in other cultures as well, just to get a good understanding there. So very important. We looked at that, and we know that that was the sea peoples that settled in this area. As we can see, this do a last picture to put a summary there. So we know that they came out of here. They settled in here. They settled over here as well. They also went down, as we know about the Sea People's invasion. They went down and settled in these areas and these areas, as we see in the Sea People's invasion. As you can see here, they came out these areas. They took these areas. They attacked these areas, and they took these areas. And we talked about the Hittites are also Indo-European that invaded this area first, that had a large portion of I and J that settled in that area, right? True, for the sake of understanding. So they come out, settle here, and they go down, they settle here, right? The ones that settle here move and they settle in here. And apparently these are the ones that are doing the Sea People invasion. They settle here and they settle in these areas. So they're settling all these areas. And that Indo-European invasion is actually from them. So these invasions is actually from this group. And we could also look at the genetics, and that's what we're looking at. So one family, not from him, though this group later is called Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Amorites, and Hittites. But guess what? That whole family that is named after those nations is actually from Japheth, from the lines of Japheth, from an Indo-European invasion that took place through the areas of the world. So this summary on this is just a note I'll put in the description. This is just about ancient Levant and ancient areas. This is on F. I'll put these in the description. And maybe this one, because this is what I was using for the star graph, but this is mostly on E1, B1A, this little note. I'll put it in the description as well, which has the star graph on it. So with that, family, if you have any questions before I go, long story short, there was a ancient Indo-European invasion and dominance in the Levant before Israel came out of Egypt, Africa. So that's very important to know. So with that, be blessed, be beloved, and amen.